Okay. Good afternoon. Before I officially get started, I just want to acknowledge all of the young people in the room. It is truly inspiring and a great testament to the organization that CNAS is and its mission, which is to train and develop the next generation of national security leaders. In addition to the important work that CNAS is doing in other areas, CNAS also has a natural security program which recognizes that the security of nations is increasingly dependent on the security of natural resources, such as water and energy. I imagine that over the last year, we've all heard various reports discussing the U.S. energy boom, most of which have been focused on the impact of the energy boom on the economy and the jobs outlook. We here at CNAS, however, not surprisingly, are interested in the geopolitical implications of the U.S. energy revolution. So one of the big projects of the National Security Program over the last year has been to look at the geopolitical implications of the U.S. energy boom. So earlier this year, we convened a series of working groups where we brought in the intellectual horsepower of energy experts from other think tanks, from the U.S. government, from academia and the private sector to help us think about what are the geopolitical implications of this U.S. energy boom and what are the critical issues facing the U.S. We have been fortunate enough to have three intellectual heavyweights and political luminaries spearhead and co-chair the working group. So at this time, I'd like to recognize one of our co-chairs, Senator John Warner, who's here with us today. Thank you. Thank you, Senator, for your support. It's been an honor to work with you. We have also been graced with co-chairs of Ambassador Paulo Dobriansky, who's up at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson. When we launched this project, there were a number of reports in circulation that each contained various and sometimes competing estimates and projections about U.S. energy production over time. Now, given the intent of this project and the fact that the working group participants came from very diverse backgrounds, some more economists, others political scientists or historians, we felt that it was truly critical to the success of this project to begin the conversation with the same baseline of understanding derived from fact-based analyses. And so our working group reviewed different expert perspectives on recent developments in the North American energy sector. In that same spirit, CNAS invited Dr. Drew Erdmann from McKinsey & Company to provide today a fact-based overview of recent North American energy developments and to suggest potential questions regarding the North American energy boom's potential geopolitical impacts that all strategists and national security planners should consider as we watch these developments unfold. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Drew Erdmann, who has graciously agreed to join us today and share an abridged version of a longer briefing on this very important topic.
Hey, thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you, CNAS, for the invitation to come here today. Also, before beginning, I want to thank a few colleagues. Matt Rogers is the director in our San Francisco office. Tommy Inglesby, who's now with Cobalt International in Houston, and Susan Lund from the McKinsey Global Institute, among other colleagues, have really helped and contributed to the perspectives that we're going to share with you today. And again, what we'd like to do is outline just some of the baseline facts of what has actually been happening, not speculation, some of the baseline facts, and again, raise some questions for the future. And I think the headline message is that the North American energy boom is really, really big. It's already here, and it's going to matter a lot. It's not going to matter just to people sitting in this room in Washington, D.C. If you're in Bangkok, Buenos Aires, Baghdad, Bogota, or perhaps especially Beijing, this is a topic that has to be at the center of your strategic calculus. So I'm going to speak briefly about it. There's a lot of nuance that we're going to have to skip over today, but hopefully can hit those headlines. So I was trained as a historian, so I look back a little bit. This is just 6 or 7 years ago. You may remember, we were running out of oil. We were going to live in a world of $200 a barrel. It was peak oil. These are headlines of the last month. I could have pulled from the last week comparable headlines from around the world. So first thing I take away from this is a lesson in humility, right? I mean, it's like the physicist Niels Bohr, the line about prediction is really difficult, especially about the future. So I approach this with a high degree of humility. But one of the things, again, trained as a historian, let's look a little bit back at the history of what's happened. What's happened in the last few years to account for this swing in headlines that normally isn't in the 500 or 700 word articles. So that's what I'd like to start off with today. Okay. So the first thing is there's a lot of terms: shale oil, shale gas, unconventional, fracking, et cetera, just to level set on what we're talking about. Basically, normal oil and gas, in essence, is in big cavities beneath the ground. You penetrate it somehow, and through natural pressure, the gas or liquid emerges. Okay? What we're talking about with unconventionals or shale oil, shale gas is basically tiny pores of these either gas or liquids that have to be released. Basically, the technologies that have been developed, and again, these technologies were first developed in the 30s and 40s and 50s in the United States, but only have really kind of come online state of the art in the last 15, 20 years. Basically, drilling a hole, going horizontal, and these are up to kilometers long and in parallel, horizontal, then pumping basically sand and liquid or other composites into the rock, shocking the rock, opening it up, and then pulling out either the liquid or gas. That's what we talk about when we talk about fracking or unconventionals or shale. I just want to level set on what that's about. Okay, so the first part of the story, there's two parts of the story, and then I'll get to the implications. The first part is the gas story. So these are the plays that exist in the United States. The dark blue are those that are already producing. You'll see up in North Dakota, we'll talk about the Bakken, in particular about the oil, but the Marcellus Shale you often hear about in Pennsylvania and Ohio. What's been dramatic is that basically in the last 5 years, our estimates of what gas we have in the United States has doubled because through the exploitation and the exploration, we learn more about what we can take out of the ground. A friend of mine in Houston jokes, we've reached the point where people no longer look for gas in the United States. The estimates are triple digits, over 100 years worth of reserves. If you're in the business, you don't even bother looking. There's so much out there that is known, that is recoverable, that's economical. So that's a totally different world. Okay, what's the pace of this change? As in my role, I use a lot of numbers now. So apologies for some of the charts that are going to come up. But for the United States Geologic Survey, in the year 2006, they estimated that the total reserves of shale, technically recoverable, in trillion cubic feet was 54 trillion cubic feet. This is 2006. This is what it is today. 7 years later, that's an increase of over 680% in the estimates of our reserves. There are other things, there's the same order of magnitude of increases in the last, let's say, 5 years. Okay, well, that's an estimate of reserve. What's reality? This is a chart of the reality of what's been coming out of our territory in natural gas in the lower 48. It's been increasing over 50% a year since 2007. Now it's almost, it started off 2007, only about 5%, a tiny sliver of our gas. Now it's almost 50% at the end of last year, probably around 50% at the end of this year. There's an incredible transformation. The shading, you can see the core, the solid bottom is from Barnett, which is out of Texas, and then Marcellus and other plays are coming online. So a huge dramatic increase in the actual production. Again, this is a story, this is reality, this isn't speculation. Okay, so what? Sometimes a simple chart tells a lot. And this is gas prices in the world. We're the orange, Henry Hub in Louisiana, let's use that as a standard. The royal blue on top is basically what it costs to get LNG in Japan, and the navy blue in between is what it costs to get it in the UK. what we've seen is a global decoupling of gas markets, okay? The other thing is that the United States is uniquely, or North America, I should clarify, including Canada, we are uniquely privileged in this regard, which means this is for the foreseeable future an enduring structural advantage in cost of energy. This has raised a bunch of questions about LNG exports and a series of policy discussions about those, but also very practically from an economic standpoint, there's some references to very high-tech, disruptive technology manufacturing. What this means, though, is that anything in the world that requires a lot of gas or energy to make, the United States is the privileged place to make it. Petrochemicals, plastics, metals, paper pulp. Has huge implications for the flow of capital that's already happening in the United States and will continue to do so in the future. So we'll come back to that in a little bit later. The next chapter, oil, and I qualify up in the corner so far. We know the oil story is a big deal also, but we don't know how big, quite frankly. We don't know what the upper ends of this development are going to be. There's a whole bunch of uncertainties about what plays will come online, some technical efficiency. The gas story we're pretty confident on, but the light tight oil, it's a big deal. The reason it's called light tight oil, that's another expression for shale oil or unconventional oil. What comes out of, let's say, the Bakken in North Dakota is actually lighter. It's not a heavy crude. It requires much less refining. It's actually closer to what comes out of the ground in, let's say, in Nigeria or Angola or Saudi Arabia. It's actually a physically different composition. Won't be able to get into some of the infrastructure implications of that. But the bottom line is that what's the story here? It's a big story. How big? It's a big deal. Look at this chart. It's a hockey stick. This is production of light tight oil in the United States. In the year 2005, in December, it crossed 100,000 barrels a day. 7 years later, last December, when we have the data, it's over 1.8 million barrels, an 18-fold increase. This is real. You can see the light blue up there is the Bakken play in North Dakota. On top of it, the kind of grayish one is Eagle Ford down in Texas. And you see in the corner all these other colors. Those are the question marks. How big will they be? Will they have the same kind of hockey stick dimension here? That's what some of the uncertainties are. But this is, again, a dramatic transformation. We're adding basically around 30 to 50,000 barrels of additional production on top every month. That's what we're adding because of these shale plays. Okay, what does that mean overall? Again, where we stand, the crude oil production in the United States as of December, L48 for lower 48 states. Already, LTO or light tight is over 35% of that production. So even when you roll in the bottom chart with the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska, LTO is here. It's already 1/4 of our production. It's literally month by month, you see that pie chart shifting. A few percentage points every year. Okay. How high, how fast? That's a question. We don't know, but we tend to be a bit bullish because the oil developments are faster and steeper than gas. So what's this chart? The navy blue line is shale. The royal blue line is LTO, okay? And what this is calibrated to, the starting point of 0, T equals 0, is when they crossed 100,000 barrels a day equivalent in their actual production in the United States. And what you see is the dotted lines where they meet is basically 7 years in. And you see that the royal blue line, the rate of production increase, roughly paralleled in terms of energy equivalent what was going on in gas, but it's taken off, even above that, even faster development. Now, there's a whole host of reasons behind that we'll talk about in a second. Now, again, we don't know how high that curve is going to go. We don't, but we have some ideas of what the ranges might be. So again, LTO it's there, it's rapid, it's growing, and it's on a steep curve. Now, one of the nuances among many, but one of the nuances is it isn't just the number of wells that are being drilled in the ground and using horizontal and fracking technology. The actual effectiveness, the efficiency as well, is getting better as people learn the geology and the techniques as well as the technology. So what I have up here, this is gas. This is an IP for initial production in the first 60 days of gas wells drilled in the United States. And this is an important part of the story, is that we're getting better at this every year. Year on year, you look at that, and basically we've been around 20% effective cumulatively, year on year, getting better, getting more and more out of the ground for every well, in addition to putting more wells in. Okay, that's the gas side of the story. Now, the reason why it's so steep on the oil side of the story is this. That's the oil side of the story, meaning our well efficiency the last few years has been increasing over 40% cumulatively per year. Okay, this is one part of the story that accounts for how, that accounts for the scale, scope, and speed of the change that we've been seeing here. Okay, now I just want to suggest a few questions for people in the audience. So what are some of the implications of this? This is historical data, but what are some of the implications of this for strategists wherever you are in the world? Well, it was noted in the introduction, the US economy is going to be a lot stronger. Okay? This is some research, this is a preview of some research by my colleagues in the McKinsey Global Institute. We're doing a report on economic game changers in the US economy. It's going to be released in about 4 weeks, available on the web. And one chapter is on the shale oil, shale gas. Again, the scale of this that we're talking about, when I say it's big, we're talking an additional 2.5 to 4.5 percentage points added to the US GDP. The US is a really big economy. Those are really big numbers. And when we talk about maybe up to 1.7 million jobs, and again, I've seen higher estimates than this, it's all ballpark, it's all order of magnitude. These are really big numbers. The other thing that's interesting about the 1.7 million is that these tend to be high-paying jobs. What we've been looking for in an economy of basically blue-collar jobs that are very high-paying. Estimates are roughly twice the income than comparable jobs for education levels in the economy. So as we walk across, it's not just the oil production, right? It's the manufacturing, which you talked about, the plastics and steels and petrochem. It's the follow-on services, and it's other sectors, retail, construction, et cetera. But again, we're looking at something that could be up to $700 billion added to our economy. And I've seen higher end estimates above that. But this gives you an order. So that raises the question, what does it mean when the United States is, in this period of time, in the next decade or so, uniquely privileged? What does it mean for a budget? What does it mean for a self-confidence? What does it mean for Americans' perceptions of themselves in the world? Does this mean that there's a sense of isolation or independence? Does it mean that there's a sense of strength or assertiveness? I don't know. The other fact here, which you don't have, is that basically, as the United States pulls out and decreases its oil imports, that basically halves our balance of trade deficit. So that's another thing that you can look forward to. Okay. Now, a bubble chart. You're going to say, what the heck is that? Okay, it's actually very simple. First of all, the bubbles are the top 25 countries that export oil to the United States. This is 2012 data. And the bottom of the chart, the x-axis, just tells you how important oil is to their economic relationship to the United States in terms of trade, not in terms of finance, in terms of trade. So on the 100%, that means Iraq, basically 100% of their exports to the United States are oil. It's totally defined by oil in terms of trade. And at the other end of the spectrum, where you have the UK or Thailand, it's a small fraction. So that tells you how important it is to the relationship in an economic sense. The y-axis is the percent of that country's GDP that's tied up in this oil trade with the United States. So you look at something like Chad, it's like over 20% of their GDP is oil trade with the United States. Now, this is, and the size of the circles, I should say, is how much it means to us in terms of the share of our imports. And Angola is roughly 5%, or there's a little circle up there. But what does this mean, to step back from the simple display of data? First of all, I want to talk about, allied this for a little bit, which is there's an integrated North American energy market of Canada and Mexico for a whole host of reasons. There's some complexity there, but let's put that to the side for now. The next category, though, is these are the countries of the world. And this is what's unusual about this as a national security problem, is that you can look out into the future and say, there will be changes, fundamental changes in our relationships with these countries, if you accept that economics matters to relationships between nations. As a premise, that's a premise. But oil is central. These are countries where basically over 75% of the trade, usually 90% of the trade or more, and over 5% of their GDP is tied up in oil exports to us. And this is starting to go away. The next group is those where it's really important, and that spans from like the Egypt or Algeria, lower GDP numbers, below 5%. This is an important part of our economic relationship. And then you get down towards the other end of the spectrum, the Norways or the Russias or the Brazils or even, really when you get to Thailand or the United Kingdom, that these are, it's important to those involved in the trade, so to speak, but it's not on the national stage. Okay. I said in the intro, it's big, it's already happening now. The question I have is, what does it mean for these relationships when this trade begins to decrease and disappear? Now, of course, on the one hand, someone will say, well, they can sell the oil elsewhere. Yes, that's precisely the point. That means that the relationships will be changing. What does it mean when Nigeria and Angola, and I mentioned that their oil is closest to what comes out of the Bakken. Last month, they were at the lowest level of exports to the United States since the 1990s. And the front page of their papers is about how they need to get their oil to China, because the United States is backing out first the oils that are closest to what is coming out of the ground in North Dakota. That's already happening. So that you ask yourself the question, what is the implications for the capital flow? What are the implications for diplomatic leverage when you look at some of the countries on the navy blue side when you have a conversation and you no longer have economic relations with that country? Does it matter? I don't know. But that's a question that people should consider, we'd argue. Okay. Another big implication. Oh, one final thing I should note before moving off this chart. The fact that we're backing out like Angolan oil or Nigerian oil, et cetera, the implications of this are also physical, like it isn't bits and bytes. This is stuff moving around the world. We'll see a world more than likely where the transatlantic trade of oil will not exist or may be reversed. And the oil will physically be flowing more towards Asia. What that practically means is that there could be 2 or 3x the number of ships through the Indian Ocean, the Straits of Malacca. And those sea lanes of communication will only increase in importance. At the same time, they'll be for our allies, but not for ourselves. And so that raises a question of the global commons. Okay. Third potential implication, emphasize potential. It's about the global pricing regime for oil. So, okay, countries can shift and sell their oil around the world. But what happens to the overall price of oil? This is where we have a scenario standpoint. There's a whole set of assumptions behind each scenario because, as I said up front, we don't know where this is going fully. And it depends upon technological developments, well efficiency, the geology of plays that are coming online that we don't know. But if you live in the upper scenario, and we'd argue that any strategist would have to consider that at least, you're looking at something where you've got the United States at 15 million barrels a day of production. Saudi Arabia is between 9 and 10 million. This is where the world in which we backed out everything we're exporting, potentially. Well, that's one world, but that also disrupts potentially the global pricing regime and away from OPEC control to something else. And that just raises the question of a world in which, here's just a heat map of the countries of the world that depend most on hydrocarbons for their public finance and their exports. Every continent, there are countries that are totally dependent upon hydrocarbon pricing. And if there is a global disruption, and again, if we produce so much that it disrupts the global pricing dynamics, all these countries will be under strain in a particular way. We don't know, but this is maybe something you need to think about. Okay, time's running out, and I just want to hit a couple more themes. The last question, which is how long do the United States have an enduring advantage? Often, gas is everywhere. 70% or more of the reserves are outside of North America. The important part here is that we list off 9 factors that have contributed to why shale gas has taken off in the United States. The important thing is geology isn't the thing. It matters, it certainly matters, but that isn't why we have the success in North America. Number two, this land accumulation, land rights. One of the biggest things is that in the United States and Canada, if you own the land, you can develop the land, and you get the benefits of the land, including the stuff beneath it. Most countries of the world, that is not the case. There's issues of property rights. There's issues historically of that, relatively speaking, we've had greater water availability, infrastructure, a whole host of factors. The number 9 down here, that we have the oil field support, it matters a lot that the structure of our oil industry is a bunch of independents who innovate and run around as opposed to national oil companies. There's a whole host of reasons why there's been innovation in driving this in the United States and Canada. So what's the take-home message in terms of the time frame that we're talking about, let's say the next 10 years? What we graphically did was put together this kind of land acquisition on one side all the way out to consolidation on the other, kind of schematically the phases of the development of shale resources. And the facts are that right now the United States and Canada are way down that curve, much farther than anyone else. And it isn't because of geology. The geology exists elsewhere, as you often hear. It's because of things like mineral rights, land ownership, infrastructure, water availability. So China's making a big push. They have a lot of capital. They can, there's a host of countries that will be driving on this. For the period of time, if you say the next 8 or 10 years, it's hard to imagine someone catching up. But that also means that for this period of time, the United States and Canada have a privileged position in all the things that we've been talking about, unless there's a true dramatic technological breakthrough or something like that. Because this is just really hard to do, the stuff we're talking about. So I know we covered a lot of ground. I know I put a lot of data up there. But I just want you to take away from this, the North American energy boom is really big. It's already here. The numbers are not, those are historical numbers. They're growing literally month by month, and it's going to matter a lot. It's going to cascade through the system. And that's really questions for those who don't work in the private sector but work in your areas to try and figure out what those complicated and cascading interactions are. So I really appreciate it. If you're interested in more of our reports publicly and the McKinsey Global Institute reports that our think tank does, those are the websites. But I really appreciate your patience. Thanks so much.